Deep in the darkness, where horrific truths hide behind walls of silence, there is a story that has never been told until now. In the depths of the abandoned countryside, there lay a haunted farm, said to have been soaked in the blood of victims from a famine centuries ago. That famine was no ordinary one. It was a true curse that turned humans into monsters. With no food and panic spreading, hunger began devouring the minds of the villagers, transforming them into cannibals. But the savagery they endured left an indelible mark. Hunger wasn't the only killer. There were strange rituals performed in the darkness of night. The few survivors claimed to have seen groups of villagers dragging victims to the center of the fields, where deep pits were dug as mass graves. The victims were tied to old trees, their bodies mutilated before the eyes of the rest, who screamed but could do nothing but submit to their grim fate. The trees themselves became cursed. After each killing, the villagers poured the victims' blood on the roots, believing it would restore their strength. Over time, the trees morphed into grotesque forms, their branches growing into shapes resembling human hands. Some said that at dusk, those branches could be heard cracking, as if crying out in pain. When hunger claimed the last souls of the village, the farm became eerily quiet. But that calm was only the prelude to something far darker. On moonlit nights, strange sounds began to echo through the fields. Whispers in an incomprehensible language carried a clear threat. Those who ventured near the farm reported seeing shadows moving among the grass and disfigured faces peering from the trees, silently watching. The land was no longer just an abandoned farm. It became a prison for the souls who died in savagery. The blood that soaked the soil hadn't vanished. It turned into a curse, drawing anyone who dared approach. It's said that those who enter the farm never return, and if they do, they're no longer the same person. Four friends, Isabel, Matthew, Clara, and Vincent, decided to explore the farm after hearing the chilling legends surrounding it. The night was at its peak, and the moon barely peeked through the thick clouds. The air was heavy, as if carrying mysterious whispers. As they neared the farm, they noticed how the road leading there seemed to swallow the light, replacing it with an oppressive darkness that felt suffocating. The mist covering the ground seemed to rise from the farm itself, creeping slowly toward them like invisible hands trying to grasp them. With every step closer, the air grew colder, as if unseen spirits were draining the warmth from their bodies. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, resembling muffled screams or the sobs of someone in pain, but the source was indeterminate. It felt as if the sound emanated from the ground itself. Matthew suddenly stopped and said in a trembling voice, "Did you hear that?" They turned to him, but before anyone could respond, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind them. When they turned around, no one was there. The trees lining the path appeared to lean toward them, their long branches resembling arms trying to grab them. On one of the tree trunks, Clara noticed strange carvings, shapes that looked like ancient symbols or markings etched by fingernails. When she touched them, she felt a sudden heat under her fingers and heard a faint whisper, "Do not cross." As they reached the rusty gates of the farm, Isabel froze. Her eyes were fixed on the distant fields, where she saw a shadow moving among the tall grass. "There's something there," she screamed, pointing with a trembling finger. But when the others looked, they saw nothing but darkness. The path to the farm felt like a passage to another world, a world full of living nightmares. With every step, the darkness grew denser, as if they were walking straight into the heart of the curse. As soon as they stepped into the fields, they felt something strange in the air. There was no scent of grass or soil, but a sharp, metallic smell reminiscent of rusted iron. Suddenly, cold droplets began to fall on their faces. Matthew, who extended his hand to check, froze in place when he saw that the droplets were blood. Clara screamed, pointing towards the sky. They saw dark clouds forming into the shapes of twisted, screaming faces, though no sound came from them. The voices, instead, emanated from the ground itself, as if the farm was breathing in pain and hatred. When they tried to retrace their steps, they realized that the path they had come from had vanished. The fields stretched endlessly, as though they were trapped in a living maze. Vincent, holding a flashlight, directed its beam toward the adjacent field. What he saw made him drop the flashlight. Decaying bodies were emerging from the soil. Their limbs were thin and unnaturally elongated, as if searching for something lost. Their eyeless faces seemed to stare directly at them, while their mouths, twisted into grotesque shapes, emitted grinding sounds like bones being crushed slowly. A suffocating stench of decay filled the air, as though the ground was vomiting its horrifying past. Isabel ran toward an old barn nearby, followed by Clara, while Matthew and Vincent attempted to fend off the crawling creatures. Matthew screamed frantically as he tried to pull away a pale hand that had emerged from the earth and grabbed his leg, its claws digging into his flesh and leaving bloody marks. Inside the barn, darkness was so complete that even their breathing seemed to echo. The smell of death was overwhelming, mixed with a sharp scent resembling burning flesh. When Isabel lit a small lighter, the flickering light revealed a horrifying scene. The walls were covered in human skulls, some engraved with incomprehensible words, fresh blood oozing from them as if they were bleeding anew. Most terrifying of all, the hollow eyes of the skulls seemed to move, slowly following them. Behind them, the barn door slammed shut with a loud bang, making everyone jump. The sound of heavy footsteps approached from outside, but they weren't ordinary footsteps. They were accompanied by the screech of metal scraping against the ground. Clara tried to force the door open, but she felt an invisible wall pushing her back. The door didn't just vanish. It was replaced by a solid wall that pulsed as if it were a living heart. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and small cracks appeared, seeping hot blood. Whispering voices filled the barn, but this time, they weren't just indistinct sounds. The words seemed to call their names, accompanied by faint laughter that grew sharper and more terrifying. Outside, Matthew and Vincent desperately tried to escape, but the ground itself seemed alive, breathing with a malevolent intent. Thick black roots burst from the soil, twisting like serpents, and gripped their legs with an irresistible force. The roots weren't merely plants. They pulsated as if they were veins of a living creature, emitting terrifying cracking sounds as they slowly dragged the two men toward the dark fields. Matthew, in a fit of hysterical desperation, used a nearby rock to strike the roots with all his might. Black blood began pouring out of them as though a ruptured artery had been cut. He managed to free himself with difficulty and ran toward the car as fast as he could, his heart pounding furiously. But when he glanced back to see what had become of Vincent, there was nothing. Just an empty, silent void where Vincent had stood moments ago. Only shifting shadows in the distant fields remained, as if they swallowed every trace of him. Inside the barn, the atmosphere grew even heavier, and the whispers transformed into muffled screams that became clearer with every passing second. The sound of something dragging itself across the ground drew closer, slowly and horrifyingly, as though the creature approaching wanted them to savor every moment of terror. When the creature finally emerged, it stood taller than any human. Its body resembled an exposed skeletal frame, with torn skin hanging like tattered rags. Bare skulls with hollow eyes stared at them, and a mouth full of jagged, uneven teeth emitted unbearable grinding noises. Its hands ended in long, blade-like claws dripping with a black, deathly smelling fluid. Isabel tried to scream, but the creature leapt at her with terrifying speed, pinning her to the ground with its claws. In an instant, it slashed her throat with a single swift motion, and blood sprayed in all directions, turning the floor into a crimson pool. The scream of agony she let out was enough to freeze Clara's blood in her veins. Clara, paralyzed with fear, couldn't even move. Matthew, who had reached the car, desperately tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't respond. Instead, the car radio switched on by itself, emitting strange sounds, whispers of Vincent's name, then Isabel's, and finally his own. Each voice grew closer and closer, as if speaking directly into his ear. By morning, when the villagers returned, the farm looked different. The once dead and desolate fields had turned unnaturally green, as though they had been rejuvenated overnight. The car Matthew had left behind was still there, but its doors were open, and the seats were covered in a thin layer of dried blood. One of the villagers, an old man who always warned others to stay away, swore he saw a shadow moving through the tall grass, red eyes staring at him from a distance. It was as if the farm was still waiting for new visitors to complete its feasts.